Hi guys, welcome back. We're going to get through Unit 5. We're almost there, folks. 2 more weeks to the AP exam. I'm super excited for you guys. I really think that we have the opportunity to have a lot of you guys get qualifying scores this year. So again, keep on plugging away. You got 2.5 weeks to go. I really think that you guys are going to kill the AP test this year. I think you're prepared. I think you're well studied. I think that everything's going to fall into place at the right time. So hopefully you guys are continuing to progress, and you're as confident as I am in your abilities. And I owe you guys a huge thank you. I know this was less than the ideal situation with the whole COVID shutdown, but man, you guys have just really done a great job preparing yourselves still for the test. So Unit 5 is going to deal with land and water use, with the exception of one thing. I'm going to move impacts of mining into Unit 6 because Unit 6 deals with energy, and that just lends itself better to talking about mining since we're mining for coal and all those things. Unit 7 is just going to be a real brief review since it was the last unit we talked about, which is pollution, air pollution. Don't forget water pollution, not on the exam this year. Uh, uh, Global change, not on the exam this year. Sustainability, iffy on the exam. Most of it's not, but there are parts of it that are. Sustainable agriculture, sustainable farming, sustainable forestry, all those things are still on it, but most of sustainability is not going to be on it. So without further ado, we're going to get into Unit 5 on land and water use. This is a huge unit, so it's going to be a few videos here with this one. I'm going to do my best to be brief and concise. I know I can get over wordy sometimes, but again, big unit. There's, I think, 17 different learning targets in this unit to accomplish. So the first thing is the tragedy of the commons. If you think back to, oh gosh, early in the year, we talked about the tragedy of the commons. We did our little goldfish fishing lab where we had the bowls of goldfish around the room. You rotated around trying to catch as many fish as you could. That's what the tragedy of the commons is all about. It can be applied to everything, not just oceans and fishing. So what it is when you look at a shared resource that everybody has equal access to, anytime you have a equal access shared resource, people look out for their own self-interest. So inevitably that shared resource gets overconsumed because they're worried about what's best for them. They don't care about what's best for the whole or the betterment of society. So that's going to lead to a depletion of resources. It could be with fishing. It could be with um, agricultural land when we're talking about farmers with shared grazing rights to certain pasture land. It could be something a little bit different where we look at the atmosphere. Everybody has equal access to that clean air. We're looking out for our self-interest, so people like to drive diesel trucks. Diesel trucks are heavy emitters of pollution. Then they take the step further and they wanted to roll the coal and put out all the black smoke. Well, all that's changing the climate. We're now breathing in and sharing that pollution. So that's what the tragedy of the commons is all about. So we've again been stopping every once in a while, asking you to do a few tasks. So go ahead, pause the video in a second and look and see if you can explain how toilet paper purchasing during the COVID shutdown fits the definition of the tragedy of the commons. So go ahead, take a second, see if you can do that. You don't have to write it out, but get an idea how you would answer this on the AP exam. It's better if you write it out, but again, you don't have to. All right, so hopefully you guys, linked everything kind of together and you started to think, well, everybody has equal access to that toilet paper at the grocery store. Anybody can go out and buy it and they can buy as much as they want to. There's no limits or restrictions on how much they can use. So it is the shared common resource. Everybody has equal access to it. Everybody can use as much or as little as they choose. During the COVID shutdown, I know you guys probably don't grocery shop, but you heard all the stories. You probably saw all the Snapchat videos of people running out of toilet paper and being scared about it, and then the people who were hoarding toilet paper and buying as much as possible. So we had that shared resource. Explain answers always have to be, the what, the how, and the why of it. So you need to fully explain and link everything together. So I would start out my answer by explaining what the tragedy of the commons is. Tragedy of the commons is going to be a situation where you have a shared resource that everybody has equal access to, but nobody owns. Then I would go and give an example of it. In stores, toilet paper is on the shelf Everybody's able to go and grab as many rolls or as packages as they want, so there's no restrictions or limitations on its usage. It fits the definition of the tragedy of the commons because when the COVID shutdown started, people started buying and over consuming toilet paper. Instead of just buying what their family needed normally, they were buying 2 or 3 extra packages to make sure that they had enough in the future. By the time 5 or 6 people did that, the resource inevitably got destroyed. There was no toilet paper left on the shelves. That's how it fits the definition of the tragedy of commons, and that's the depth you want to go with your answers for those explain type questions. Again, explain answers need 2, 3, 4 sentences in order to fully answer them. If you're answering it in one sentence, you're not getting points. So make sure that you're going to that depth of it. So our next thing that we look at is clear cutting. And that tragedy of the commons is going to be a unifying theme throughout this unit. Every one of these aspects that we're going to talk about can be an example of the tragedy of the commons. So when we talk about clear cutting, ask yourself what it all means. Clear cutting is a method of cutting trees down to provide us the resources that we need. Lumber, pulpwood for toilet paper, pulpwood for paper products, paper towels, paper plates, gosh, I just went blank, paper that you're writing on, all those different things. So when you clear cut, it's the most efficient method of doing it because we're cutting down every single tree over the entirety of a large tract of land. And this large tract of land we're talking about, it's not like a large tract like talking about the size of our school campus. We're talking on the grander scale, 20, 30, 40 acres minimum. 20, 30, 40 acres minimum would be like the size of Murraysville Community Park. We're taking it from being completely forested, cutting every tree down over the entirety of it. It's going to be a mass production type of thing. And if you remember, scales of economy kick in. The more you do of something, the cheaper it is to do. So the more trees we cut down, the cheaper it is to cut down each of the trees. Because now you don't have to worry about where they're falling or anything like that. You go in with heavy equipment and just bulldoze over. I don't want to say bulldoze because you're still cutting them down. You cut down every tree and let them fall where they are. Take the trunks of them out, leave everything else behind. So take a second, figure out why we should care about it and why it's still done. All right, the reason why we should care, that's our ecosystem services that are done by the forests. The provisioning, the regulating, supporting services, all those different things. So some of those services that we get from the forest, try the brainstorm just in your head while I'm going through these. We have oxygen production done by the trees. We have CO2 absorption, so climate regulation. And it's not just climate regulation from the CO2 absorption, it's also creating those little microclimates because now we have water going up into the atmosphere from transpiration. That's going to help to absorb some of that heat energy and regulate the climate as well from that. So we have CO2 absorption and climate regulation. Now, another important part to note, never use CO2 as an example of a pollutant. It's not going to be a pollutant in terms of anthropogenic pollution. CO2 is going to be a climate disruptor. It's going to absorb heat energy. It's a greenhouse gas. So don't link it into being a pollutant. Forests do absorb pollution, but CO2 is not one of those pollutants it's absorbing. So when we talk about that, we can add pollution absorption. As the water is polluted, as the soil is polluted, some of those pollutants get absorbed into the tissues of the tree and get stored there for extended periods of time. Other ones, we get lumber from them. All of those regulating and provisioning services that we have, biodiversity preservation, we have nesting sites and all those different things within the forests. Those are all services that we get from the forest. So why should we care? When we clear cut, we're eliminating all of those services from the ecosystem. Major human impact on the environment. If we lose our ability to have nesting sites for animals, populations are going to go extinct. That's why we need to care about it. Not only is it affecting humans, but it's affecting everywhere else. If we take all the trees down, now we have higher erosion rates. The water that falls rushes down the hillside. There's no roots to hold the soil in place. We have massive amounts of erosion. As that sediment goes into the bodies of water, that sediment then clogs the gills of fish, causing them to suffocate. It also helps to raise the temperature of water because those particles now, make that water have the ability to absorb more heat. Because now, instead of it just being flowing crystal clear water, it has that turbidity to it. Those particles then, the sun hits them, they absorb heat, and the water warms up. That warmed water puts physiologic stress on the fish. So, why do we still do it? That's the big question. We know it's bad for the environment, but we keep on doing it anyway. And one of the big reasons why we do it. So these are the why we should care. We see increased soil erosion, increased stream temperatures, increased flooding, decreased pollution absorption, decreased CO2 absorption. We can also get into decreased oxygen production, all of those other things. But the why it's still done, that's the big thing. It's the most profitable way of harvesting trees. The timber industry and lumber industry is one of the big industries in our society. Even in the developed world, the more economically developed countries, we use that wood every day without thinking of it. We're constantly building new buildings. Interiors of the buildings use wood products. If you're building a skyscraper, you're not building that skyscraper structure out of wood, but there's wood being consumed in the production of the insides of that for furniture, for the desks, all those different things. So we need to offer that at a cheap price so that people can afford to buy them, or the demand's going to go down for those products. So there are companies that do this deforestation or logging methods. They're trying to make as much profit as they can by offering it for cheaper prices. Now they artificially inflate the demand for it. The other big one in the more economically developed countries is pulpwood. And a lot of times it's toilet paper. Again, the COVID shutdown, big problem with toilet paper availability. But we not only cut trees down to grind them up into pulpwood, we mix it with water and a bunch of other stuff, and it makes fibrous material. So that fibrous material is used to create everything that we use on a daily basis. Think about a paper towel. It's a once and done thing. Toilet paper, once and done. You cut down trees to make those products when there's alternatives available for those. We can use other materials instead of trees to make those products. If you remember back to the Tragedy of the Commons lab, I brought in those leaf plates, the palm leaf plates. The palm leaf plates were what we used at our wedding. We didn't want to use China because we were only getting married. We weren't renting anything. It was more of a party type of situation as opposed to a formal setting. So we use those renewable plates, and those palm trees grow and shed leaves very quickly. So it's a renewable resource. We didn't have to cut the palm tree down. We just had to take the leaves from it. So there's alternatives out there. We can use hemp and we can use bamboo and all kinds of other stuff to provide us that wood. So it is still done because it's the most profitable method, but there are better alternatives out there than doing it. It's just a matter of being willing to increase the price of it. Now, in the less economically developed world, it's done for a different reason. More economically, for building materials, pulpwood. That's the big reason why it's done. But in the less economically developed countries, a lot of times it's done to provide charcoal. Charcoal is a cheap, reliable source of energy for them. You cut a tree down, you basically bake it within a high temperature, and it drives all the moisture and all the gases out of the wood, creates that charcoaly material. So, think about like a campfire the next day. You always see, the semi-burnt logs that are still sitting there. That's the charcoal that people are using to heat their homes, cook with, all those other things. So in the less economically developed countries, they cut down huge tracts of land that's forested just to provide them with energy. Last time I looked at the statistic, it was over 2.5 billion people that had biomass as their only source of energy on the planet. So it's a huge portion of our population. We use it more for the building materials. They're using it for a energy source. So take a second. Again, proposing solutions to problems is one of the big parts of this AP exam. Take a second, pause it, see if you could come up with a solution to our problem of clear cutting and deforestation. So many of you guys probably said, use a more sustainable harvesting method. Instead of clear cutting, how about selectively cut, only take the mature trees out and replant with other trees? That's a great idea, but that has to be backed by legislation. So have government legislation to require the use of selective cutting practices, then go into it and explain what selective cutting is, and then also tie in for each tree they cut down, another one must be planted. That would be a great thing. Providing alternative energy sources for countries that are requiring the charcoal. Build better infrastructure to provide renewable resources for energy. Don't tie it into saying, instead of charcoal, we could provide them with natural gas to burn and oil to burn and coal to burn. That's creating other environmental problems. We want to make sure the solution to our problem is benefiting the environment, not harming it. So here we would want to provide government subsidies to offer clean, renewable energy sources for lower and cheaper prices. When you say clean, renewable energy sources, tell them what clean means. Non-carbon emitting energy sources, such as wind, solar power, all those different things. So that's what we're looking at with the clear cutting. So take a second, explain how clear cutting impacts global atmospheric CO2 concentrations. That's a question you may be seeing on the AP exam in some way. So when you're explaining clear cutting impacting global atmospheric CO2 concentrations, it is not, as big as I can write it, not releasing CO2 itself. So it is not releasing, clear cutting does not release CO2 into the atmosphere. What it does is reduce the ability for forests to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Less forests means we have less absorption of CO2. That lower absorption of CO2 means that at our current rates of production of CO2 or emissions of CO2, our global concentrations are going to rise. We're putting the same amount in, taking less out. That's what causes the atmospheric carbon dioxide to rise, not directly releasing it from clear cutting. Clear cutting does not do that. The only form of deforestation that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is slash and burn, because now we're combusting those tree trunks. The carbon that's stored within them is released into the atmosphere. When we cut normal trees down and we use them for paper products and for building materials, that carbon is stored there for long periods of time. And again, this just goes through that. Again, remember, cutting trees does not release CO2 into the sky. It's not stored in the trees as a gas. It's incorporated into the tissues of the tree. So, follow-up question to it, explain how increased atmospheric CO2 levels are impacting our climate. Take a second. Again, note that it's an explain answer. So when we look at the answers to this, carbon dioxide absorbs and traps heat in the lower atmosphere. That causes global temperatures to rise. That's not your ending answer. That would be a describe type answer. We need to connect and make it go further. Again, explain questions. Think about evidence and reasoning with it. So those increased global temperatures then are going to cause disruption to the wind patterns, precipitation patterns. They alter growing conditions. They affect biodiversity, because now what used to be a certain temperature range is no longer that temperature range. It used to be a certain precipitation, no longer that precipitation anymore. So the animals are outside their optimal range of tolerance. It puts physiologic stress on them. They face those three choices: adapt to the new conditions, migrate to find the conditions they like, or they die off. What we're seeing is our climate is changing so quickly, they're not having the option to migrate or adapt. They're just dying. That's why we're in the midst of our mass extinction that we're in right now. We can also get into ice cap melting, causing global, ocean levels to fluctuate, all those different things. So how can we make it better? We can make it better by practicing sustainable forestry as opposed to clear cutting. So what we can do are mitigation efforts. Mitigating is reducing the impact of something. We're still going to do it, but we're going to lessen the impact it has. So first thing, we want to use ecologically sustainable forestry. This is going to be a bunch of different things. It can be using alternatives to cutting. So we can use selective cutting. We can use reforestation efforts where we're going to plant trees elsewhere. We want to reuse the building materials that we're normally consuming. So instead of going out and buying a new chair and a new dinner table because the old one is just old, it's still perfectly functional, but it's just older. Kitchen cabinets are a great thing. I watch those home improvement shows with my wife. She loves them. I hate those shows because all I see is completely unsustainable living. They're every time they go into a new house, they tear the cabinets out, they tear all the drywall down. All of that is still perfectly good building materials. They just rip it out and throw it away. So instead of ripping it out and throwing it away, reuse it. Donate it to Habitat for Humanity. Donate it to the resale stores that are out there. That way they can sell those to people who normally wouldn't be able to buy those types of equipment because they're too expensive, but now they can afford because it's offered in a reused situation. Or simply saying, hey, my table's perfectly fine. I'm going to reuse it for a different purpose. I'm going to, refinish it and make it a different color. Now it's going to match the decor in my house. All those are methods of reducing the demand on our resources. But this ecologically sustainable forestry is a big, big one. The selective cutting, and then there's also different certification programs you can go into where you can apply if you're a company that does logging and woodwork and things like that. You can apply for certification that the wood was harvested in a sustainable way. My kitchen cabinets have a little logo on them that says that the wood used in them was harvested sustainably. Now I know that when they cut those trees down, new ones are replanted. They did it in a more ecologically friendly way or ecologically sustainable way. Ecologically friendly is a bad phrase to use on the AP exam. You always want to tell them how it's more ecologically friendly. So the other thing we can start doing is minimizing the loss of our forested land. We're not going to cut them down on purpose and use them for building materials. We're going to do that sustainably, but we also have to minimize how much happens naturally, how much is destroyed in a natural setting. One of the things that we see every year is there's different insects and different diseases that go through that affect forested land. One of the reasons why you're seeing such a big problem with the California wildfires is the major drought they had. But another tie into that is they had different beetles and organisms that went in and they killed a huge number of trees over the years. Those trees have just been standing there drying out and becoming combustible. In the state of Michigan, they had something called an emerald ash borer that went through and it attacked ash trees, ASH trees. Those ash trees then died, became more combustible, and now we're at risk for forest fires. So we can develop IPM plans, again, integrated pest management. Circling back to the previous chapters, integrated pest management, if you remember, is that multi-tiered approach to managing pests. We're going to talk about it a lot more here towards the end of this unit, but it's using mechanical methods, physical methods, biologic and chemical methods to limit the damage of pests. If we can bring the amount of forested land that's destroyed by those pests down, now we have more trees and more forested land over our planet. We're gaining the benefit of those ecosystem services. In addition, we can allow for less of our forests to burn each year. By doing prescribed burns, we're burning all the combustible material out of the forests and not allowing them to reach that wildfire type of setting. So the California wildfires that we had, the wildfires that were in Australia, if we were practicing prescribed burns, we could have prevented a lot of that damage because you're burning off the dead trees and the dead plant life. That reduces the amount of combustible material. Now, if there's one of those forest fires, whether it's natural from lightning or anthropogenically caused by some guy out there with a forest or with a fire out in the woods that gets out of control, now it doesn't burn as much of our forest down. It also doesn't get to the extreme temperatures where it burns off the living trees. So those prescribed burns, again, very, very important. They're intentionally set fires by the fire department to help burn off the dead and combustible material in a controlled way that doesn't negatively impact the forests. So that's the end of our first video here. I'm going to check for understanding. Take a second, please describe 2 ecosystem services provided by intact forest ecosystems, and then describe 2 methods for mitigating the human impacts on forest ecosystems. I'll start out the next video describing what the answers are to this. So have a good time, and we'll be back with our next video here in a second.